I've always believed that there are things out there beyond human comprehension, but I never thought I'd have to experience them firsthand. I was part of the NASIFs, a government-backed organization tasked with investigating anomalous phenomena across the United States. Our team had dealt with strange disappearances, paranormal reports, and bizarre environmental events, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered in that godforsaken river. It all started with the reports. Hundreds of people had gone missing in the same stretch of river in the Appalachian Mountains. These weren't just any disappearances. No bodies were ever found. No wreckage, no traces, just the eerie quiet of the river, which seemed to claim lives without leaving a single mark. At first, the cases were dismissed. People get lost. Sometimes, they wander off, they get caught in the underbrush, or they drown. But then the stories started. The whispers about the river. How it wasn't just a body of water. How it had something inside it, something ancient. Something hungry. Our job was simple: investigate, find out if there was a pattern, and if there was any evidence that something criminal or paranormal was behind these disappearances. The first time I saw the river, I thought it looked harmless enough. On the surface, it was just a slow-moving stream cutting through the forest, like so many others we had encountered in our line of work. But as I stepped closer, I felt an odd chill in the air. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something in the atmosphere, a heaviness that I couldn't explain. The fog that rolled in was thick, like it had a life of its own, and the trees around us seemed to close in, blocking the sunlight. I could barely make out the horizon. Agent Morgan, my superior, had already started unpacking equipment. He was the first one to mention the rumors. They say the river has its own kind of pull, he said, unzipping a case filled with monitoring devices. People get too close, and they are never seen again. Some say they hear whispers. Some say they hear screams. He paused, then looked at me with a slight smile. I'd say it's just folklore, but then again, we're here. The rest of the team was already setting up a base camp a little further from the water. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be looking for. I had read the reports, each more chilling than the last, but it all felt like a bad mystery novel. Surely, there had to be some logical explanation. By nightfall, we had all gathered by the fire, the sound of the river constant in the background. We tried to stay calm, to make light of the situation, but something felt wrong. The air smelled stale, like it had been trapped in the fog for centuries. We heard the occasional rustling of leaves, but nothing seemed normal. That's when I saw it, the shadow. It was brief, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, but it was enough to stop me cold. I turned, but nothing was there. I told myself it was the fog playing tricks on my mind. I even laughed at myself. But when I looked back at the river, I could swear the water had shifted. It wasn't flowing the way it should have been. It almost seemed alive, twisting in unnatural ways, as though it had a current of its own design. Did you see that? I asked, but no one answered. They were all looking at the water. That's when it happened. The first scream. It came from the edge of the river. A woman from another team, Michelle, was standing too close to the water, staring at something in the distance. It was as if she was hypnotized. Then the scream, high-pitched, desperate, echoed through the night air. Her hands shot out in front of her as if trying to grasp something invisible. In one swift motion, she was gone. I ran toward the river, my feet slipping on the wet ground. I screamed her name, but the only sound that answered me was the roaring of the water. The river wasn't a calm stream anymore. It was violent, churning with a ferocity that I hadn't seen before. I reached the bank, but it was too late. The woman was gone. We searched for hours. The mist had gotten thicker, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. But we didn't find her. Not a trace. Not a clue. It was as if the river had swallowed her whole. That night, none of us slept. We sat around the fire, the only source of light in the growing darkness. We tried to talk, tried to rationalize what had happened. But nothing made sense. The river had claimed her, just like it had claimed all the others. And as I sat there, staring into the flames, I realized something I should have known from the start: the river wasn't just a river. It was a trap. The days that followed were a blur of dread and disbelief. We tried to continue with the investigation, but each step we took brought us closer to something we weren't prepared for. We set up cameras along the banks, hoping to capture something, anything, that would explain the disappearances. But all we got were strange, distorted images. Shadows that shouldn't have been there. Movements in the water that didn't make sense. The more we investigated, the more the river seemed to fight back. Each time we tried to gather evidence, the weather worsened, or equipment malfunctioned. The fog became more oppressive, as though it had a will of its own, creeping into our tents and suffocating us in our sleep. It wasn't long before we realized that we weren't alone. There were things in the fog, things we couldn't see clearly, but we felt them watching us. I'm not talking about animals or even people. These were things that didn't belong to this world, things that had been here long before us and would be here long after we were gone. One evening, just before dusk, I wandered off by myself. I don't know what drew me to the water. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something darker, something the river had planted in my mind. But as I approached the bank, I saw it again, the shadow. This time, it was closer. It was tall, twisted, with long, slender limbs that seemed to move in unnatural ways. It wasn't human, not even close. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless, a dark void where a face should be. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The thing didn't come toward me. It didn't need to. It simply watched. And in that moment, I understood. It was the river. The monster was the river. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, back toward camp, but I knew it was following me. The river had its hooks in me now. It was hungry, and I was its next victim. By the time the rest of the team arrived at the riverbank, I was already in a state of hysteria. I couldn't stop shaking. My clothes were soaked from the mist, and my face was pale, drenched in sweat. I told them everything, about the shadow, about the feeling that the river was alive. But they just looked at me, their faces unreadable. I saw it too, Morgan said quietly. His voice was hollow. We all saw it. None of us spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. We knew what had to happen. The river had claimed its first victim. And it wasn't going to stop until it had all of us. It's been days now, and the river hasn't stopped haunting me. I can still feel its pull, its unrelenting call, even when I'm far away from the water. But no matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to ignore it, the fear remains. It's lodged deep within me, like something growing inside my chest. The river hasn't let me go. Not yet. We're all back in the camp now, but we don't speak much anymore. The team is fractured, shattered by what we've seen, and what we've lost. Michelle is gone. Vanished. And even worse, we still don't have any answers. We only have questions. We only have fear. The river keeps coming up in every conversation, even though we try to avoid it. At night, we hear the water, a constant rushing sound that seems to be getting louder. It's like the river knows we're listening, and it's taunting us. It was on the fourth night after Michelle disappeared that things began to unravel completely. I was on watch. Alone, sitting by the fire, trying to stay awake. It was quiet, too quiet, and the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. My eyes were heavy, my mind drifting, when I heard it. A soft sound, like a whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the rustling of trees, but no. It was something else. A voice. Help. I froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The voice of a woman. Her voice. Michelle. My heart skipped. There's no way. She was gone, lost to the river. There was no way she could be out here, calling for help. Help me. The voice came again, closer this time. It sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave my post, not now, not when I was the only one who could hear it. I stood, shakily, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The voice was coming from the river. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. Nothing. The river was still, unnaturally still. But I could feel it. I could feel the water moving beneath the surface. It was watching me. The river was watching me. Help. I took a step closer to the water. Something in me urged me to go. Maybe it was the voice, the desperation in it. Or maybe it was the lure of the river, something that I didn't fully understand, but couldn't resist. My foot slipped on the wet ground, and I stumbled, catching myself just before I fell into the water. The mist swirled around me like a living thing, and I felt the temperature drop several degrees. That's when I saw it. A figure. A woman, standing just beyond the river's edge, barely visible in the fog. Her hair was wet, hanging in limp strands, her clothes soaked through. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes. God, her eyes. They were hollow, black pits where eyes should have been, staring straight at me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her lips twisted into a silent scream. She reached toward me, one hand extending across the water, beckoning me to come closer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. That's when I heard the others. Morgan and the team came running from the camp, yelling for me to stop, to get away from the water. I could barely hear them over the rushing in my ears, the deafening roar of the river. But I could feel their presence, their panic, and that was enough to snap me back into reality. Get away from the river. Morgan screamed, his voice cutting through the fog. I blinked, and in that split second, the figure vanished. The water was still again, calm and dark, like nothing had happened. Are you out of your damn mind? Morgan grabbed my arm, pulling me back from the bank. He was panting, his face flushed with anger and fear. What were you doing? You could have been next. I looked around at the rest of the team, their faces pale and tense. None of them said anything at first. They were too afraid, but I couldn't shake it. That woman, she was real. I knew she was. And yet, when I looked back at the river, there was no sign of her. The water was quiet, like it had been all along. I tried to convince myself that it was just a hallucination, a trick of the fog. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. The days blurred together after that. The team was on edge. We didn't talk much about the figure, though we all knew it was real. The whispering woman. The one who had called to me, just like the stories said. But there was something else too, something deeper that none of us dared to speak of. The river wasn't just a trap. It was alive. It had a will of its own, and it wanted us. Morgan tried to keep things together. He gathered the team for a meeting, but it wasn't like before. There was no enthusiasm, no confidence. Just fear. The cameras had stopped working, the equipment was malfunctioning, and the fog was thickening every day. We couldn't even get a proper signal on our radios anymore. It was as if the river itself was blocking us out. I think we need to leave, Morgan said, his voice hoarse. This isn't what we signed up for. We're not prepared for this. We're out of our depth. But no one moved. No one spoke. We all knew it was too late. We couldn't just leave. The river had already marked us, and it wouldn't let us go that easily. We were part of its story now. That night, the whispers started again. Faint at first, like a breeze through the trees. Then louder, clearer, until they were impossible to ignore. The voice wasn't just one woman anymore. It was dozens, hundreds, whispering at once, overlapping, pleading, screaming. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't escape it. The river was all I could hear. The way it roared, the way it called to us. It was alive, and it wanted us to listen, and then, in the darkness, I heard it again. A voice. But this time, it wasn't a woman. It was a man. His voice was deep, guttural, filled with anguish. Help me, help me. I knew exactly who it was. It was Morgan. There are moments in life when everything changes. When the veil between reality and nightmare dissolves, and you can no longer pretend that what's happening isn't real. That's when the river claimed us. I remember that night like it was a dream, no, a nightmare, but the kind of nightmare you can't wake up from. The voices were louder now, echoing through the fog, filling my head with a maddening chorus of pleading, crying, screaming. It was the river. The souls it had swallowed. the ones that had vanished without a trace. They were trapped inside the water, their voices lingering like shadows in the mist, desperate to be heard, and then, there was Morgan. He had been the one to push us forward, to ignore the warnings. He had been the one who kept telling us to stay calm, to stay focused. But now, as I looked at him, his eyes wide and wild, I realized we were beyond saving. The river had claimed him just like it had claimed Michelle, just like it had claimed all the others. "Help me," his voice rasped, barely audible above the deafening roar of the river. I turned to him, frozen. His face was pale, his body trembling, like he was fighting something invisible. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. His body jerked, his hand reaching out as if something invisible was pulling him toward the water. It wasn't just a hallucination. It wasn't just the fog. I could feel it, too, the pull of the river, like an invisible hand reaching into my chest, tugging me, dragging me closer to the water's edge. "Stop!" I shouted, but it was useless. Morgan was gone. In the span of seconds, he was gone. The river didn't even make a sound. It simply took him, like it had done to Michelle, to everyone who had ever come near it. I ran to the edge, but by the time I reached the water, there was nothing. No sign of him, just the swirling black depths of the river. That's when I knew. It wasn't a river. It wasn't even a body of water. It was something else, something older, something darker. The river was alive. It wasn't just pulling us in. It was feeding. It was hungry. The sound of it grew louder, the water rising higher, as if it had grown to fill the very air around us. The river wasn't just a place, it was a force, a living entity that devoured anything it could touch. The trees around us bent as if in submission, their twisted branches reaching out toward the water. The mist thickened, crawling like fingers over our skin, suffocating us, and I knew, in that moment, that we weren't just dealing with something unnatural. We were dealing with something ancient. Something evil. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices, those endless, pleading voices, grew louder, more frantic. I could barely hear my own thoughts over them. It was like they were inside my head, urging me to come closer, to join them in the river's cold embrace, but then something else happened. The air around me shifted. I turned, slowly, and there it was, the creature. It wasn't human, not in the slightest. It was a mass of shadows, twisted and dark, with long, thin limbs that moved unnaturally, as though its bones were made of something other than flesh. Its face, if you could call it a face, was nothing but a void, a deep, inky blackness that seemed to swallow any light that came near. Its mouth, wide and stretched unnaturally, hung open, dripping with dark, viscous fluid, like the river itself had taken form. It stepped forward, moving with a terrifying grace, its tendrils of mist swirling around it, as though the fog itself was part of its being. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed with fear, my entire body refusing to respond. The creature didn't speak. It didn't need to. It didn't have to. Its presence was enough to make my heart stop, to make my breath catch in my throat, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling, too terrified to even move. The only sound was the river, its endless flow, its pull. It wanted me. It wanted us all. I snapped out of my stupor. My mind was racing. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it take me. I needed to run. I turned, and there they were. The rest of the team, standing at the edge of the camp, staring at me. They didn't move. They didn't speak. "Run!" I screamed at them. "It's coming for us. We need to leave, now." But they didn't respond. Their eyes were wide, vacant, as if they were trapped in a trance. Their faces were pale, their bodies stiff. The river had taken them. I ran until my legs gave out beneath me, until I couldn't breathe, until the fog swallowed me whole. But it didn't matter. The river was always there, pulling at me, calling me back. It would never let me go. I don't know how long I've been here, trapped in this haze, lost in the fog. All I know is that the river is still out there, still waiting, still hungry. And it's watching me. It always watches. The American organization NASIFs had officially abandoned their investigation of the river. No survivors were ever found. Some say the river still calls to those who venture too close, but the government has long since closed the case. The missing people, dozens, hundreds, are just statistics now, a dark chapter in a forgotten history, but I know better. The river isn't gone. It's still out there, waiting for the next victim, and I am its prisoner.